Welcome back to Media7, where I'm talking to the makers of Maori Television's version of It's in the Bag, Libby Hakaraya and Tainui Stevens. Now, this month marks 8 years on the air for Maori Television, but the story of Maori on television goes a lot further back than that, as Jose Barbosa shows.
This is a short and, by necessity, incomplete look at Māori on television. From the beginning, TV needed performers, and so it's likely the first time the country saw Māori on screen, it was in a music context, or just as part of the chattels.
What's your idea of New Zealand? Tourists love it, and why not? It's full of scenery and picturesque Maoris.
Ernie Leonard was one of the country's early presenters, co-fronting the weekly smackdown that was On the Mat.
It was just an absolute hullabaloo, and wrestlers over the floor all over the place.
Kia ora, and welcome to this Monday evening's viewing with us.
For 10 years, Marama Martin's job was to announce the upcoming shows for that night. Warm and reassuring, if in the future our TVs start talking back to us, they'll probably sound like her.
And then we've an NZBC drama starring Bill Johnson and Ian Moon, and it's about a man called Taggart who finds that a hit-and-run case is anything but routine.
In the year previously, the 6-part documentary series Tangata Whenua screened. Made by Barry Barclay and producer John O'Shea, the series has been described as the founding document for Māori television.
I never get bringing the rushes back to Pacific Films, which had a very long filmmaking tradition then, and good filmmakers, and screening the rushes, and no one could quite believe that this world was really New Zealand. I mean, it could have been Peru or Kathmandu. And people had not ever seen anything like this.
Perhaps it is the wish of your ancestors that you stay behind as an elder for Queen Te Ata.
The coming decade saw an explosion in scripted drama.
I must not break my promise to Four Eyes. You cut it down.
The 80s brought Koha, the first regular Māori show in prime time.
Our first story is from Lake Waikaremoana in the Uruweras. It concerns the communities around the Waimako and Kuha maraes.
TV's become an important tool for promoting te reo and for examining Māori issues through current affairs programming.
There's a huge reaction to Te Karere because a lot of people saw it as invasive. They didn't want the Māori language on their TV, in their homes, and so we battled, not only with our viewers, but we also sort of fought hard to get facilities.
Māori protested their dissatisfaction with the populist Pākehā news media and the lack of a secure Māori presence on television.
But while producing television is never easy, Māori creators have almost always had to scrape and beg and fight to get their ideas on screen. But when that happens, it's all ours. It doesn't belong to anyone else. And that's something to celebrate.
It strikes me that both of you got your start in broadcasting at quite interesting times. I mean, Libby, you began in broadcasting just as Maori radio was emerging. How was that for you? Did it feel different? Because you worked at Radio I and then it was Iwi Radio.
It was Henare Tua who actually shoulder tapped, well, he didn't shoulder tap me, he told me that he was going to look after me. And then he rang me and said, you're coming to work for us, and took me literally from a place that I wasn't happy in, and that was Aotearoa Radio, which was the first national radio network for Māori. And it was a very contentious time because we'd just come through a lot of protest, a lot of anger. It was all there, it was all still there. So, but it was the first time that I actually got out to report on that stuff and found that what I wrote wasn't being torn up and literally thrown in the bin.
That was happening to you at Radio I?
In commercial radio, it was happening to me. Not so much at Radio I, but at 91 FM at the time was a different, completely different beast. And anything Māori it had to be reported as basically those bad activist Māoris, It was just badly reported. And so I felt I saw the opportunity to immerse myself there, but I just found that too frightening. and I was young, and I wanted to be a war correspondent. I decided I wanted to be a war correspondent, so I took myself off to Sydney, and which is where all the wars are, and spent the next 7 years working for the ABC. And so whilst I didn't actually go to any wars, I went to quite a few other sorts of events, like train disasters and, you know, terrible sort of big events.
You learned your trade.
And the people that were training me, because I had no training in New Zealand prior to that, were war correspondents, and most of them were New Zealanders, journalists, and they were the whole, the whole thing. They were this hard-smoking, hard-drinking, highly intelligent journalists, and I just loved them. And so they looked after me for a while.
Was that good for you? Because when I've talked to young Maori journalists before, they've run up against that. The big problem is they have to go and get the story, and then they go and get the story, and they're told, don't disrespect your elders.
Well,
did you cop that?
Well, not so much, because I sort of fell between. I don't know. I sort of fell between. I could go places and actually sit alongside people, and I think my naivety was such that they would talk to me, and then I would try and take what they'd said and basically write it so it was consumable, and it wasn't, and that really frustrated me. I mean, this is after I came back from my years as a war correspondent, and I went a bit further afield, but there was no war, and came back to New Zealand, and again Henare rang me up and he said, look, I want to do an interview with you on Radio New Zealand about your travels, and so we sat in the studio for an hour or so, and we talked about all the sorts of things I've been doing. And then Sharon Crosby actually rang Henare and said, oh, that was great. It's like, there's the kaumata and the young broadcaster. Why don't you do a show? So that was Whenua. That was the start of 7 years of national radio, a magazine style
Which worked incredibly well, I have to say.
Well, it was very
for that
funny,
reason, that was the chemistry.
Well, that was the chemistry, because, of course, I was still going out and falling into the studio. I mean, it was a Sunday show. So the show would start at 2 o'clock, and, that's just far too early. And so I'd be arriving literally very well prepared, of course, and Henare was the consummate, the master of preparation, as a lot of his generation were. So, I'd arrive and be ready, of course, and he would have everything just, and he never excluded me. He included me. So even though I had no idea who that person was over there, not half the time, but some of the time, and sometimes he didn't know either, actually, to be honest, I quickly picked up that this was a person of, significance, not just Maori, but, and he really was the person that took me around this country in a Maori way. Sent me to marae, took me on to marae, introduced me to all these people, and I would say that it was only in hindsight, as I got older, that I realised what a gift that was.
Tainu, did you have mentors as well?
Totally, and I think a mentor is really important in life. And for me, that was Ernie Leonard. I started working in Koha back in those days.
Which was the first show of its kind.
Yes, it was, and it was kind of interesting because back then it was a quarter of an hour in prime time on a Sunday evening, and that was a good slot. And I remember vividly I was producing it around 87 and getting a letter from someone saying, thank you for your show because it helps me to understand my neighbour. That was the value of prime time. I mean, back then too, our dream was to get into prime time in Te Reo. And 28 or so years on, the differences seem to me to be many. In the first instance, back then, we knew every Māori working in broadcasting because there were so few. Now, we don't. And one of the things that I delight in is there's all these new faces, these smart young people popping up, learning their craft and doing their thing. But Ernie was really important to me, and much like Henare was for Libby, he kind of liberated me and allowed me my head to go and try stuff. And he was always there to sort of fix things or whatever. But
I wonder if that thank you for helping me understand things also been the theme of your career as well. Because you seem to me to often have been the bridge between the two worlds. You've got that role formally with the New Zealand Air Board, but you're the translator in more than one sense.
I think if you work in storytelling, which is what we do, after a while you realise that you only ever tell a few stories in your life. And for me, most of those stories have kind of dwelled around identity or war, oddly enough. And part of that I've realised is that I've tended to be a little bit of a cultural diplomat or interpreter or whatever. That's just that's the way my molecules are kind of arranged, I guess. And those are the stories I tell. We got into the industry in a time when, and it's still like that to a degree, we can think up ideas, we can think up new formats because we don't have a long tradition actually holding us back. So for any Māori storyteller working in broadcasting, formats are exciting things that can be new. We don't have to imitate anyone else. And whether we're making entertainment, doco, drama, whatever, we can offer a new way. And that hasn't changed. Nowadays, 28 years on from when I started, we have a lot more opportunity to get our stories out there. And you know, one of the delightful things about The Bag is that although there's a lot of real Māori in the show, the Pākehās in the, I mean, there's a big difference between Stratford and Pātea. But, you know, for all the Māori that we use in Stratford, no one gets upset, and they may not understand, but there's no ill will or sideways looks, as there were when we started. I remember in this building, you know, sometimes the Māori Programs Department, when we'd be doing our thing, there'd be a sideways look. That has changed. In fact, I think now the sideways look come from envy.
Well, you're now mentoring young journalists who have had something you didn't have, which was immersion education. They've grown up with the real.
Yeah, and that's a really exciting thing. I mean, the language, like any language, offers all sorts of clues as to how to tell a story, and there's lots of creativity in all of that. And while for us, you know, we spend a lot of our time learning our culture on the job, these young people already have it. I would hope, though, that they don't ever lose sight of the fact that people struggled to get them where they are. Their parents' generation particularly, it's a difficult thing to be a Māori parent and not speak the language but access it for your children. You know, that takes commitment. So there's been a sense of mission for decades, and while these young people have that benefit of that education, I think it's beholden upon them to remember how they got there, because, you know, storytelling actually for our people is a mission. If information is power, it is only power because it's shared. So we, in storytelling, shape that information into stories. It's simple stuff, really.
Well, and you're all set for the grand final in Whangarei.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's
I mean,
right.
I think we've done 51 towns now, and that's 51 parties. It's hard work.
Yes. I have gathered you're a fairly social production.
Luckily, we have this beside the bed, of course. Not every crew member, they will get one eventually, but we thought we were doing quite well until one of the crew members pointed out that Selwyn did 100 shows, so he had 100 parties. So we've got a bit of a thing to go to. But look, we're very generous and we made this for you. So you can watch it when it goes to air. We even put the magnetic tape on.
Lovely, and it'll fit on my fridge. Thank you so much.
It's hilarious.
Thank you so much. And when's it on there?
8th of April.
8th of April. Righto. Thank you, Libby Hakaraya and Tainui Stevens. And that's our show. We'll be back with Media7 at the same time next week. Until then, take the bag!